All right, so I got an absolutely wild article here for you guys from Politico. And before we get into this, you kind of got to piece this article as part of the broader picture of all of the propaganda that we have been seeing since Biden decided to exit the war in Afghanistan, or at least pull our boots on the ground troops out of Afghanistan. We have basically been seeing a full-throated, a choir of establishment media pro-war hacks who have been coming out and doing basically everything other than analyzing why we actually went to this war in the first place, why it lasted 2 decades, and what the actual consequences were for the people in Afghanistan. They have been giving an analysis trying to break down everything other than that reality and avoiding it at all costs. So here's basically the article from Politico, which is portraying State Department officials as the actual victims of the Afghanistan withdrawal. So they say this experience broke a lot of people inside the State Department amid the Afghanistan withdrawal. The chaos that came with ending America's longest war extended to Foggy Bottom, where staff were left with psychological scars. So before we get into this, I just want to say up front as a clarification so people don't come after me for this. Number one, I 100% support mental health access for literally everybody across the board. I think that should be universally applicable to every single American citizen. So you're going to see why that's relevant in this specific piece, but that's number one, fully support mental health access for everybody, regardless of what the potential causes actually are. And number two, we really should have spent a lot more resources and focus on how we were going to get everybody out of Afghanistan who needed to get out of Afghanistan instead of staying there to suffer the wrath of the Taliban. So those are the two main points I want to say just before we get into how ridiculous this article actually is within the context of what leaving the Afghanistan war actually meant. So they say interviews with more than half a dozen State Department employees, in addition to government officials and advocates, as well as a review of internal administration emails Politico obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, revealed the desperation and disorganization that consumed frontline State Department employees as they feverishly attempted to assist Afghans and Americans stranded in the war-torn country, and fielded a crush of calls and emails. The inbox where the State Department directed Afghans to send special immigrant visa applications crashed at least once, and officials say they were unclear of their own authorities and what policies they were allowed to employ to help evacuate people. It all triggered mental health issues for some staffers, from which some are still attempting to recover months later. Okay, so they're saying basically they suffered psychological trauma from not being able to adequately adapt to the process of getting people out of the country as we were leaving the Afghan war. So they say their stories are a testament to the U.S. government's lack of preparedness through the cratering security situation, even as President Joe Biden pushed through his decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan by August 31st. Okay, so first of all, their stories are a testament to the U.S. government's lack of preparedness. Okay, yes, that's 100% true. They obviously were not prepared to actually handle this, but why is that? I mean, they frame it in this article as if like President Joe Biden just woke up one day in late August and just decided like, hey, I want to leave Afghanistan without warning. Let's just pull out all of our troops and see what kind of chaos unfolds. No, that is not at all what happened. In fact, if you actually remember the beginning deal that was made by the Trump administration, okay, this deal to leave Afghanistan was literally made before Biden even took office, and they're framing it in this article as if like he just sprung it on them randomly and they couldn't have anticipated this or prepared for it in any way. So just to give you a reminder in terms of how we ended up with the situation that Biden was facing. So originally, under the Trump administration, the Taliban agreed to start peace talks with the Afghan government and considered a ceasefire with the government, and the Taliban had been killing Afghan forces throughout this, attempting to use violence as leverage in negotiations, and we're talking about in early February of 2020, and the deal laid out an explicit timetable for the United States and NATO to pull out their forces. In the first 100 days or so, they would reduce troops from 14,000 to 8,600 and leave 5 military bases. Then, over the next 9 months, they would vacate all the rest, and the United States, its allies, and the coalition will complete withdrawal of all remaining forces from Afghanistan within the remaining 9.5 months. The deal reads, and the United States, its allies, and the coalition will withdraw all their forces from the remaining bases. The United States, in turn, would release the 5,000 Taliban prisoners, and the Taliban will release 1,000 of its prisoners. Okay, so you understand here, we are talking about a deal that was made in February of 2020 under the Trump administration before we even had the whole 2020 election in the first place, okay? So this was not something that came from nowhere. And if you look at the actual timetable here, okay, it was supposed to be 14 months from February of 2020. So February, March, April, we're talking about the actual timetable for leaving Afghanistan would have been in April of 2021. Now, if you are, a sharp-eyed reader in all of this, you might notice that we didn't leave in April of 2021. Biden extended it even further from the original plan that was set forward under the Trump administration, and we ended up leaving by the end of August. Okay, so not only did you have the original 14 months that were laid out by the Trump administration, but you also had additional months that were set forward by the Biden administration to do even more preparedness, to be ready for the situation, to be able to handle all of the logistics of what was going to inevitably be a chaotic situation in ending a 20-year war. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to say, is I don't understand at all how any reasonable person who's working in the State Department could have been unprepared for this. How did you not figure this out within the damn near 2-year process of us knowing that we were going to leave Afghanistan? That just doesn't make any sense unless you're completely incompetent at your job. And I think if you're that incompetent at your job that you can't prepare for this in 2 whole years, then maybe you shouldn't be working in the State Department. But they continue here saying that in interviews with Politico, State Department staffers describe having been manic or suffering a complete mental breakdown at the time of the evacuation. They spoke of the need for mental health support in its aftermath, and one official reported that colleagues continue to meet on occasion for breakfast just to cry. Another disclosed seeking out therapy, and more than one State Department official described the Afghanistan withdrawal as having damaged them emotionally. The people interviewed for this article asked to remain anonymous so that they could speak candidly, and they say, quote, "We're not used to failure at the state." Let me just say that again, and I will, take a comic break for laughter at this. We are not used to failure at the State Department. You're not used to failure at the state. That's all you guys do. That's your specialty. Your specialty at the State Department is failing repeatedly. Okay, this is why we just lost the 20-year, 2 decades long Afghan war. Okay, and ended up with the Taliban in power just as they were when we started the war. Okay, this is how the Iraq war was a complete failure. How the war in Syria is continuing to be a complete failure. Okay, all you know at the State Department is failure, and they are sitting here saying we're not used to failure at the Senate. Okay, at the State Department, that's just it's comically ridiculous at face value. But they continue saying that, and in every single possible circumstance, it was a failure. Yes, clearly. One of the officials said, "You're failing with the email, you're failing with getting guidance on what we could do and what we could not do. We weren't empowered enough. No one really understood what our policy was." Well, again, you had 2 years to figure this out, okay? You had the 14 months or whatever under the Trump administration, then blending into the Biden administration. You then had additional months to try to figure out the logistics. And listen, this is what I'm trying to get you guys to understand. This was not a result of them not having enough time, okay? Or not having enough warning that we would eventually have to end the 2 decades long war that these same State Department officials wanted to extend indefinitely, okay? The reality of the situation is, a lot of these motherfuckers, especially the higher-ups within the State Department, they probably thought that Joe Biden was not actually going to leave Afghanistan, okay? They probably thought that they were going to be able to do to Joe Biden what they did to previous presidents like Obama, like Donald Trump, and convince them not to leave Afghanistan, okay? So that's really probably more of a reason why they were underprepared, is because they thought that they weren't actually going to have to follow through on a lot of this. And so when they actually were put up against it, and they realized, oh shit, Joe Biden is actually going to continue the withdrawal of our boots on the ground troops there, then they freaked out and they didn't know what to do. Okay, so again, you had the time, you had the resources, all right? There's no gap there in terms of lack of the ability to be prepared. If you were not prepared for this moment, it's on your shoulders. It's your fault, okay? So it just completely doesn't make sense that they are still acting as if this was just like sprung on them, that they had no ability to foresee what could possibly happen with leaving Afghanistan. We knew that it was going to be chaotic. We knew that it was going to be crazy and hectic. That's what it looks like to end a 2 decades long war that we never should have began in the first place, okay? But instead of actually looking at the reality of why we started this war in the first place, should it have actually been conducted in the first place? What were the consequences associated with doing this 2 decades long war? Well, let me tell you some of the consequences, because you won't see this anywhere in the political articles. They say, and this is from the Brown Cost of War Project. So they say, as of April 2021, more than 71,000 Afghan and Pakistani civilians are estimated to have died as a direct result of the war. 71,000. The United States military in 2017, under the Trump administration, relaxed its rules of engagement for airstrikes in Afghanistan, which resulted in massive increase in civilian casualties. And I think it was either 2018 or 2019 that was the deadliest year of the entire 2 decades long war. But they continue here saying that The CIA has armed and funded Afghan militia groups, I covered this story on my channel, who have been implicated in grave human rights abuses and killing of civilians, including children. And Afghan land is contaminated with unexploded ordnance, which kills and injures tens of thousands of Afghans, especially children, as they go about their daily chores. And the war has exacerbated the effects of poverty, malnutrition, poor sanitation, lack of access to healthcare, and environmental degradation. So, I mean, listen. These are the actual consequences of the war, but they don't focus on that, okay? The entire mainstream media throughout this entire exit process of the Afghanistan war, they never focused on this. They never focused on the actual consequences for average people in Afghanistan who never did shit to the United States, who didn't deserve this, for this to be their destiny. Okay, but instead of talking about that, they are trying to portray State Department officials as if they are the true victim of this entire war process. Okay, it's just completely ridiculous, because we know the reality that it wasn't that this was sprung on them. It wasn't that they didn't have the opportunity to be prepared. It was that they were never prepared. They never knew what the fuck they were doing. Okay, we knew this from the original Afghanistan papers that came out about the war. They never knew what the fuck they were doing there. They never had a clear mission. And in the meanwhile, right, you see the consequences. This is what they were doing the entire time. Okay, that drone strike that Biden launched as we were leaving Afghanistan, which they said was killing an ISIS-K suicide bomber, that we later found out was an innocent man and his family, including 7 children. That was the reality of the entire war. Okay, that wasn't some aberration. It wasn't something that, you know, was part of the exception instead of the rule. It was the rule itself. That's what the war looked like over the last 20 years. That's what the war will continue to look like as Biden continues airstrikes in Afghanistan. So it's just completely ridiculous, top to bottom, to pretend as if the actual victims in this entire process are like military-industrial complex officials who have lost out on millions of dollars. And I've literally seen, I think it was even in Politico articles, saying that the real victims of this war were the military-industrial complex officials who lost out on tens of millions of dollars in contracts. So it's like it's completely ridiculous who they are actually trying to portray as the true victims in this war.